Hello there, dear dreamers. Welcome to the Sleepy Legends channel. Tonight, we journey into the realm of ancient myth, to a story that has captivated hearts for thousands of years. A tale of springtime and shadow, of flowers and the underworld, of a daughter who became a queen. You may know her name, Persephone. Perhaps you've heard whispers of her story, fragments passed down through time. But there is so much more to discover about this goddess who walks between two worlds, who holds dominion over both life's renewal and death's mystery. Before we begin our journey into Persephone's world, if you're enjoying these sleepy legends, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue creating these stories for you. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which realm do you find more compelling? Persephone's springtime meadows or her shadowed throne in the underworld? I read all my comments and truly cherish hearing your thoughts. Now, settle yourself more deeply into comfort. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing find its own gentle rhythm. And drift with me back through time to a world that existed long before this one. A world where the earth breathed slowly and the seasons moved like a great wheel turning, always turning. There was a time, so long ago that even memory has forgotten it, when the world knew only spring. The earth breathed slowly then, in and out, like a sleeper lost in pleasant dreams. The air was warm, always warm, carrying the scent of growing things. And the light fell golden across endless meadows, soft and forgiving, never too bright, never too harsh. In this world of eternal spring, there were no sharp edges. Everything flowed into everything else. The meadows stretched on and on, rolling gently toward distant hills that shimmered in the haze of afternoon. And in those meadows, wildflowers grew in such abundance that the ground itself seemed woven from color. Blue and yellow and white and purple, nodding on their stems, swaying in the gentlest breeze. The earth breathed slowly, and the flowers moved with each breath. These were the wild places of ancient Greece, before cities rose, before stone temples crowned the hilltops. These were the places where gods and mortals moved through the same spaces, where the boundaries between worlds were thin as morning mist. The mountains in the distance were blue with shadow. The streams ran clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones, singing their quiet songs. And everywhere, there was the hum of bees moving through the blossoms, drunk on nectar, dusted with golden pollen. The earth breathed slowly, and the bees moved with each breath. Time moved differently in that eternal spring. There was no urgency to anything. Days unfolded like flowers opening, slow and inevitable. The sun rose, arced across the sky in its patient journey, and set in shades of rose and amber. And then it rose again, as it always had, as it always would. The same meadows, the same flowers, the same warm air carrying the same sweet scent. Nothing changed, and that was the beauty of it. In this world, in these meadows, there lived a young goddess, but she was not yet known by the name that would later echo through the ages. She was not yet Persephone. She was simply Kore, the maiden, and like the world around her, she existed in a state of perfect, unchanging grace. Kore was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess who made all things grow, who coaxed grain from the earth and fruit from the trees. And like her mother, Kore was radiant with life. Her laughter was like water over stones. Her footsteps barely pressed into the soft grass. When she moved through the meadows, the flowers seemed to lean toward her as if greeting a friend. She knew nothing but this eternal spring. She had never seen leaves fall from trees. She had never felt the bite of winter wind or watched frost form on grass in the morning. She knew only warmth and light and the endless meadows stretching toward the horizon. The earth breathed slowly, and Kore breathed with it. Her days followed no particular pattern because they needed none. She would wake with the sun. Though sleeping and waking were soft transitions in that place, like drifting from one dream into another. She would walk through the meadows, running her fingers through the tall grass, letting the seed heads brush against her palms. She would stop to watch bees working in the heart of flowers, their legs thick with pollen, their bodies vibrating with effort and purpose. Sometimes she would lie down in the grass and watch clouds drift across the blue vault of sky. White clouds, slow moving, their shapes changing gradually, becoming one thing and then another. A bird, a mountain, a face, and then something else entirely. She could watch them for hours, or what passed for hours in that timeless place, letting her thoughts drift as slowly as the clouds themselves. The earth breathed slowly, and the clouds moved with each breath. Other times, Kore would gather flowers, not with any purpose, not to make garlands or offerings, but simply for the pleasure of it. She would move through the meadows, selecting this bloom and that one, cradling them gently in her arms. Violets with their purple faces turned upward, anemones swaying on delicate stems, crocuses pushing up through the grass, their petals like stained glass when the sun shone through them. She loved the hyacinths best, perhaps. Their fragrance was intoxicating, sweet and heady, and their blooms clustered thick along the stem, each tiny flower perfect and complete. She would press her face close to them and breathe deeply, letting that scent fill her entirely. And in those moments, she was nothing but that scent, nothing but that sensation of sweetness and life and growing things. The earth breathed slowly, and Kore breathed in the scent of hyacinths. Nearby, though not always visible, her mother Demeter would be tending to her own work, coaxing wheat to grow taller, encouraging olive trees to bear fruit, moving through the world with the steady care of one who nurtures all things. Sometimes Kore would see her mother in the distance, a figure moving through the fields, and she would feel a sense of perfect contentment. Everything was as it should be. Everything was safe and known and good. The meadows stretched on forever, it seemed. Kore could walk for days, though she never did, never needed to, and still find new valleys, new hillsides, new groves of trees where dappled light fell through the leaves. Sometimes she would find a spring bubbling up from the earth, the water so clear she could see every pebble at the bottom, every stem of watercress growing along the edges. She would kneel by these springs and cup the water in her hands, drinking deeply. It tasted of stone and earth and something else, something that had no name. the essential taste of the world itself, cold and clean and perfect. The earth breathed slowly, and the water flowed with each breath. In those meadows, there were other creatures too. Deer that would pause at the edge of the tree line, their large eyes watching her with calm curiosity before they bent their heads to graze. Rabbits that hopped through the grass, pausing now and then to sit upright, noses twitching. Birds, so many birds, whose songs layered over one another like a tapestry of sound. The bright call of larks, the cooing of doves, the trill of nightingales that sang even in the afternoon. Because in that eternal spring, there was no real distinction between day and night, only a soft gradation of light. And butterflies, oh, the butterflies. They floated through the air like petals loosened from flowers, their wings painted in oranges and yellows and blues. They would land on Kore's shoulders, on her hair, on her outstretched hands, opening and closing their wings slowly, slowly, in perfect contentment. The earth breathed slowly, and the butterflies rode the currents of that breath. Kore had companions sometimes, nymphs who dwelt in the trees and streams, other young goddesses whose days were as languid as her own. They would gather in the meadows, weaving flowers into crowns, telling stories, laughing at small jests. But often Kore preferred solitude, or something like solitude. The quiet company of bees and butterflies, the soft presence of the wind moving through grass, the patient regard of the sun overhead. She was innocent in the way that only those who have never known loss can be innocent. She had never experienced winter, and so she could not imagine it. She had never known darkness, and so she did not understand what light truly was. She existed in a state of pure being, without question, without wonder, without the knowledge that anything could be different than it was. The earth breathed slowly, and Kore existed in that breath, unaware that breath must end before another can begin. The meadows rolled on beneath the endless sky. The flowers bloomed and bloomed, never fading, never dying, because in that time before time, nothing died. Everything simply was existing in its perfect state, held in the amber of eternal spring. The grass was always green. The air was always warm. The light was always golden and soft. And Kore moved through it all like a sleeper moves through dreams, present but not quite present, aware but not quite aware, part of the dream but also separate from it. She was the maiden in the meadow, the girl among the flowers, the daughter walking in her mother's garden. The earth breathed slowly. The bees moved flower to flower, their bodies heavy with pollen. The streams sang their patient songs. The clouds drifted across the sky, becoming one shape, and then another still. And Kore walked through it all, cradling flowers in her arms, her footsteps light on the grass, her laughter like water, her presence as natural and unremarkable as the wind itself. This was the world before the descent. This was the eternal spring that knew no autumn, no winter, no end. This was the breath before the change, the moment before the story begins, the stillness that holds all things in perfect suspension. The earth breathed slowly, slowly, slowly. And in that slow breathing, Kore walked through meadows that would not last, though she did not know it. She gathered flowers that would wilt and die, though she could not imagine it. She laughed in the sunlight, innocent and radiant, unaware that beneath her feet, far below in the darkness, something ancient was stirring. But that knowledge comes later. For now, there is only this: the meadow, the flowers, the warm air, the golden light. The eternal spring breathing slowly, slowly, holding this maiden in its gentle grasp, reluctant to let her go. The earth breathes slowly. The flowers nod on their stems. The bees hum in the blossoms. And Kore, the maiden, walks on through the endless meadow, gathering flowers that will never fade, in a spring that will never end. Or so it seems. The earth breathes slowly, slowly, slowly. In that time before time, Kore belonged to the world in a way that few ever do. She was held, always held, in the gentle grasp of her mother's love. Demeter, the great goddess of the harvest, who made the earth abundant, who taught mortals to plant and reap, who turned barren ground into golden fields. Demeter loved her daughter with a love that had no beginning and no end. It was a love that wrapped around Kore like the warm air itself, protective, complete, unquestioning. Every morning, when the sun's first light touched the meadows, Demeter would look for her daughter. Sometimes she would find Kore already awake, wandering among the flowers with that particular quality of attention the young have, absorbed completely in the small wonders of the world. A beetle climbing a stem, dew caught in a spider's web, the way light fell through a petal, turning it translucent as colored glass. Other mornings, Demeter would find Kore still sleeping in a bower of soft grass, curled on her side like a child, her hair spread around her like dark water. And Demeter would stand watching for a moment, her heart full of such tenderness it was almost painful. This girl, this radiant, innocent girl, her daughter, her joy, her heart walking outside her body. The days unfolded in patterns so familiar they felt like breathing, natural, effortless, right. Kore would rise, and she would seek her mother, and they would spend the morning together, walking through the fields and groves. Demeter tending to her work, encouraging a vine here, strengthening a root system there, checking on the wheat that grew in distant valleys. And Kore would follow, asking questions in the way children do, endless questions about how things grew and why and what made this flower different from that one. Demeter answered every question with patience. She showed Kore how to recognize plants by their leaves before they flowered, how to read the soil and know what would grow well there, how to speak to seeds, yes, speak to them, coaxing them to split open and send roots down into the dark earth while pushing green shoots up toward the light. Everything wants to grow, Demeter would say, kneeling in the soil, her hands in the earth. You just have to show them it's safe, that they're protected, that the world will hold them as they reach toward what they need. And Kore would kneel beside her mother, mimicking her gestures, feeling the soil between her fingers, cool and crumbly and smelling of life itself. She would press seeds into the earth the way her mother showed her, gently, carefully, whispering to them the way Demeter did. Grow, grow. You are safe here. Grow. The rhythm of their days was like a song with a melody, so familiar you didn't need to think about the notes. Morning in the fields, afternoon in the orchards, evening in the meadows. Each season, though there were no true seasons then, only variations of spring, brought its own tasks, its own small celebrations. When the wheat was ready in the mortal fields far below, Demeter would oversee the harvest, ensuring abundance, ensuring no one would go hungry. And Kore would go with her sometimes, watching as the mortals cut the grain, their sickles flashing in the sun, their songs rising up in gratitude. The mortals couldn't see the goddesses among them, but they felt their presence. They felt the blessing. Kore loved those moments. Watching the mortals work together, families and neighbors side by side, the children running between the cut rows, gleaning fallen stalks, their laughter bright as bells. She saw how they depended on her mother's gifts, how the harvest meant survival, meant life, meant another year of babies being born and couples being wed and stories being told around fires. They need you, Kore would say to her mother. They need the earth, Demeter would correct gently. I only help them remember how to listen to it. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and warm, Kore would often wander on her own. Not far, never far. Always within the boundaries of her mother's realm, the places Demeter could sense her, could reach her if needed. Kore didn't question these boundaries. They felt natural, like the edges of the meadow, the line where grass gave way to forest. Boundaries weren't restrictions. They were simply the shape of the world. She would gather flowers on these wanderings. Always flowers. She couldn't help herself. Each bloom seemed more beautiful than the last, each color more vivid, each scent more intoxicating. She would collect them in her arms until she could barely hold them all, iris and rose and poppy and lily. And then she would bring them back to her mother, presenting them like treasures. Demeter would accept them with such delight. Oh, these are beautiful, my love. Look at this one. See how the petals spiral? And this one, smell how sweet it is. She would weave them into crowns for Kore's hair, into garlands for her neck and wrists. You make the flowers more beautiful by choosing them, she would say. And Kore would believe her, because her mother's words were truth, were law, were the foundation of everything she knew. Sometimes the nymphs would join them, the daughters of rivers and trees, spirits of wild places who moved between the mortal and divine worlds as easily as breathing. They were Kore's companions, her friends, though friendship is perhaps too small a word for what they were. They were like sisters, like mirrors, like different versions of the same eternal youth. They would spend hours together in the meadows, weaving flowers, braiding each other's hair, telling stories that went nowhere and meant nothing and everything at once. Stories about which stream had the coldest water, which grove had the sweetest berries, which mountaintop offered the best view of the sunset. Small things, gentle things, the substance of peaceful days. Your mother watches you. One of the nymphs said once, not unkindly. always watching. I know, Corey replied, and she did know, and it didn't trouble her. Of course her mother watched. Of course she kept her close. That was what love was, wasn't it? Keeping safe the things most precious to you. The nymphs would dance sometimes, and Corey would dance with them, spinning through the meadows with her arms outstretched, her head thrown back, laughing at the pure joy of movement, of being young and strong and alive. They would dance until they collapsed in the grass, breathless and giddy, looking up at the sky and watching the clouds drift past. What do you think is beyond the mountains? One nymph asked once, pointing toward the distant peaks. More mountains, another answered, and then more meadows. And beyond that, the sea probably. Have you seen the sea? No. Have you? No. They lay in the grass, considering this, the mystery of the sea they'd never seen, the lands they'd never visited. But the wondering was gentle, academic. There was no urgency to it, no real desire to go. The meadow was enough. The meadow was everything. Corey's days were full of such moments, small, perfect, complete unto themselves. She would help her mother in the morning, wander in the afternoon, return in the evening. She would eat meals of fruit and honey and bread that appeared when they were hungry. She would drink water from springs that never ran dry. She would sleep in soft grass under stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. There was a rhythm to it all that felt as fundamental as heartbeat. Wake, wander, gather, return. Day after day after day, each one blending into the next until they formed a single, continuous experience of being. Time didn't move forward so much as it moved in circles. The same tasks repeated, the same joys returned, the same conversations happened again and again, varied slightly each time but essentially unchanged. And this repetition wasn't boring, it was comforting. It was the proof that the world was stable, that nothing would change, that tomorrow would be like today, and today was good. You're happy here, Demeter would say sometimes, not quite a question. Yes, Corey would answer, and it was true. She was happy. How could she not be? She had everything she needed. Her mother's love, the meadow's beauty, the simple pleasure of sun and flowers, and the endless spring. She didn't know to ask for more because she couldn't imagine what more there could be. In the evenings, Corey and Demeter would sit together and watch the sun set. The sky would turn those impossible colors, gold and rose and violet and deep, deep blue. And they would sit in comfortable silence, or they would talk about small things, plans for tomorrow, observations about the day just past. I found a patch of wild thyme today, Corey might say, near the old oak grove. Ah, that's good, Demeter would reply. The bees will love that. There were already bees there when I found it. Of course there were. Peaceful exchanges, the language of two people who know each other so completely that words are almost unnecessary. But they speak anyway, because speaking is another way of being together. Sometimes Demeter would tell Corey stories, old stories from the time before time, when the world was being born. Stories of titans and the first gods, of chaos becoming order, of light being separated from darkness. Kore would listen, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Are the stories true? She would ask. All stories are true, Demeter would answer, and none of them are. Stories are how we understand what's too big to understand otherwise. Kore would consider this, turning it over in her mind. Tell me the story of the seasons again. There are no seasons, my love. Not anymore. Only spring. But there used to be, once, long ago, before you were born. But I didn't like the idea of endings, of things dying and being reborn. So I made it spring always. Spring for you. Spring forever. And Kore would feel that warmth again, that sense of being cherished, protected, kept safe from harm. Her mother had shaped the world for her, had made it soft and gentle and good, had removed all the sharp edges, all the cold winds, all the dying things. What greater love could there be than that? At night, Kore would sleep deeply and dreamlessly, or if she dreamed, the dreams were only echoes of her waking life. Meadows and flowers and her mother's face. Safe dreams, gentle dreams, dreams that promised nothing would ever change. And perhaps that should have been enough. Perhaps that should have been everything. To be loved so completely, to be protected so thoroughly, to exist in a world shaped entirely around your happiness and safety. But there was something else too, something Kore couldn't quite name. Not unhappiness. She was happy, truly happy. But sometimes in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, or when the sun was at its zenith and everything was still and drowsy, she would feel it. A small restlessness, a tiny wondering, is this all there is? She would push the thought away immediately, feeling guilty for even having it. How could she ask for more when she had everything? How ungrateful would that be? But the thought would return, sneaking in during those liminal moments. That small, quiet voice asking, what lies beyond the mountains? What does the sea look like? What would it feel like to walk somewhere her mother's protection didn't reach? To step outside the boundaries, to discover something new, something unknown. She never spoke these thoughts aloud. She barely acknowledged them to herself, because to speak them would be to hurt her mother, and Kore would rather die than cause Demeter pain. Her mother, who loved her so much, who had given her everything, who had made the world itself into a gift for her daughter. So Kore continued in her routines, continued gathering flowers and walking through meadows and sitting with her mother in the evenings. She was happy. She was safe. She was loved. And that was enough. That had to be enough. The days continued, one after another, indistinguishable and perfect. Wake, wander, gather, return. The eternal spring breathing in and out, holding her gently, keeping her innocent, preserving her in amber. And if sometimes in the deepest part of the night, Kore would wake with her heart beating fast, feeling like she'd forgotten something important or like she was supposed to be somewhere else, she would simply turn over and go back to sleep. It was nothing, just a strange moment, Just a brief disturbance in the perfect calm. Nothing would change. Nothing could change. Her mother would see to that. The earth breathed slowly, and Kore breathed with it, safe in the knowledge that tomorrow would be like today. And today was good. Today was perfect. Today was all there was, and all there ever needed to be. The meadow stretched on beneath the stars. The flowers nodded in the night breeze, and Kore slept, innocent and beloved, held in her mother's perfect world, unaware that beneath her, far below in the darkness, ancient wheels were already turning. There came a day that began like all the others. The sun rose in its familiar way, pouring light across the meadows in shades of gold and amber. The air was warm. The flowers opened their petals to greet the morning. The bees began their work, moving from blossom to blossom in their patient way. Everything was as it had always been. Kore woke slowly, drifting up from sleep like a leaf floating to the surface of still water. She stretched, feeling the soft grass beneath her, hearing the familiar sounds of morning, birds calling, a stream somewhere in the distance, singing over stones, the whisper of wind through the tall grass. She rose and began her day as she always did. She looked for her mother and found her already at work in a field of wheat, encouraging the stalks to grow tall and strong. They exchanged greetings, shared a simple meal of fruit and honey. Demeter spoke of her plans for the day, a grove that needed tending, a valley where wildflowers had been slow to bloom. "Will you come with me?" Demeter asked. "Later, perhaps," Kore replied. "I thought I might walk through the eastern meadow this morning." Demeter smiled, though something flickered across her face. Worry? Hesitation? It passed so quickly Kore couldn't be sure she'd seen it at all. "Don't wander too far," Demeter said, which was what she always said. "I won't," Kore promised, which was what she always promised. And so Kore set out alone, walking through the meadow she knew so well. The grass was soft beneath her feet, the sun warm on her shoulders. She walked without hurry, without destination, simply moving through the familiar landscape, letting her attention drift from one small thing to another. A butterfly landing on a flower, a lizard sunning itself on a rock, the way the wind made patterns in the grass, waves of movement flowing across the meadow like water. She walked and walked, her thoughts as gentle and meandering as her path, thinking about nothing in particular, about everything and nothing at once. The quality of the light, the scent of wild rosemary growing among the rocks, the way a spider had built its web between two stems, the silk catching the sunlight and turning to silver. Time passed, though she couldn't have said how much time. An hour? Several hours? In that eternal spring, it was hard to say. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the position of the sun, by the quality of light, by the feeling of a moment being early or late in the day. And then she saw it. In a part of the meadow she'd visited 1,000 times before, growing in a place where nothing unusual had grown yesterday or the day before, there was a flower, a single bloom, standing taller than the others around it, commanding attention in a way that made everything else seem to fade slightly. It was a narcissus, but such a narcissus, not like the others that grew scattered through the meadows, pretty, but ordinary. This one was extraordinary. Its petals were white as fresh snow, but with a heart of gold that seemed to hold light within it, as if the sun itself had been captured there and was shining outward. The flower seemed to glow. No, it did glow. Softly, subtly, but unmistakably. And its fragrance reached her even from several paces away. Sweet and intoxicating, unlike any scent she'd encountered before. It smelled of spring, yes, but also of something else. Something she couldn't name. Something that called to her. Corey found herself moving toward it without consciously deciding to move. One step, then another, then another. Her eyes fixed on the flower, on its impossible beauty, on the way it seemed to shimmer slightly in the breeze, as if it weren't quite solid, as if it existed in this world and some other world at the same time. She knelt in the grass before it, careful not to crush the flowers around it. Up close, it was even more beautiful. The petals were perfect, flawless, each one curving just so. The golden center seemed to pulse with warmth. And the scent, oh, the scent was overwhelming now, filling her completely, making her slightly dizzy, making the world seem to soften at the edges. She reached out her hand, slowly, reverently, her fingers extended toward the stem. She wanted to touch it, to hold it, to bring it close and breathe in that extraordinary fragrance. Just one flower, just this one perfect bloom to add to her collection. Her fingers closed around the stem. And the world paused. For just a moment so brief it might not have existed at all, everything stopped. The birds ceased their singing. The wind died. The bees hung motionless in the air. Even the sun seemed to hold its breath. The entire world balanced on the edge of something, teetering between what was and what would be. Corey felt it, that pause, though she didn't understand it. She felt the weight of it pressing down, pressing in. Felt the sense of something immense gathering itself, preparing. She began to pull the flower toward her, gently, meaning to pluck it from the earth. And the earth responded, not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably, the way night follows day, the way water flows downhill, the way seasons change, though Corey had never known seasons to change. The ground beneath her began to move, to shift, to open. It happened slowly enough that she had time to notice every detail. The way the soil cracked, the fissure starting small and then widening, opening like a mouth, like an eye, like a door that had been closed since the beginning of time. The grass at the edges bent and fell inward. Small stones tumbled down into the growing darkness. There was a sound, low and deep, like the earth itself groaning, like something enormous stretching after a long sleep. Not a violent sound, not frightening exactly, but vast, ancient, undeniable. Corey stood, the narcissus still in her hand, and watched the ground open before her. She should have been afraid. Perhaps part of her was afraid, but another part of her felt something else. Recognition? No, not quite. But something close to that, as if this moment had always been waiting for her, as if she'd been moving toward it all her life without knowing. The crack widened, darkness welled up from below, thick and substantial, not the simple absence of light, but darkness that had weight, that had presence. And from that darkness came a coolness, air that had never felt the sun, that carried scents Corey had no names for. Stone and water and something mineral, something old beyond measure. She took a step back and then another, but she didn't run. She watched, transfixed, as the earth continued its slow opening, as the darkness rose like water filling a vessel. And then from that darkness something else emerged. Not sudden, not explosive, but rising slowly, steadily, as inevitable as dawn. First, a gleam of something metal, not bright, not shining, but dark as iron, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Then shapes resolving out of the darkness. Horses, 4 of them, black as the depths they came from, their coats seeming to shimmer with darkness the way the narcissus had shimmered with light. They were beautiful, these horses, powerful and strange, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the soft beauty of the meadow. Their eyes burned like coals, red and ancient. Their breath came out in plumes of vapor, as if they carried winter with them, as if cold followed in their wake. Their hooves struck the ground with sounds like bells tolling, deep and resonant. And driving them, holding the reins in hands that were steady and sure, a figure. He rose from the depths like he was climbing stairs that only he could see. Slow, unhurried, his chariot rolling up from the darkness as smoothly as if it traveled on a paved road, rather than climbing up from the very center of the earth. He was cloaked in shadow, or perhaps shadow was cloaked in him. It was hard to tell where he ended and the darkness began. But Corey could see his face, pale and stern, beautiful in the way that mountains are beautiful, in the way that storms are beautiful, beautiful and remote and entirely other. This was Hades, lord of the underworld, king of the dead, ruler of all that lies beneath. Corey knew this without being told, knew it the way you know things in dreams, with a certainty that requires no explanation. She had never seen him before, had never heard his name spoken in anything but whispers, but she knew him. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark as the spaces between stars. Not cruel, not cold exactly, but vast, containing depths upon depths, mysteries upon mysteries, eyes that had seen things Corey couldn't begin to imagine. Eyes that held the weight of eternity. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The maiden of spring and the lord of death. Light and shadow, above and below. Everything she was and everything she wasn't. The world remained still around them. The birds silent. The wind holding its breath. Even the sun seemed to dim slightly, as if granting them this moment, this meeting, this recognition. Hades spoke, and his voice was like stone grinding against stone, like water moving deep underground, like the sound the earth makes when it settles and shifts in the night. Corey, he said, just her name, nothing more. But in that name was a question and an answer and a statement all at once. She wanted to speak, to respond, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She clutched the narcissus in her hand, its stem bending slightly under her grip, its petals still perfect, still glowing softly. Hades extended his hand toward her, not grabbing, not demanding, simply offering. Palm up, fingers slightly curved, waiting. An invitation, a request, a destiny being offered like a gift. "It is time," he said, and somehow Kore understood what he meant, though she couldn't have put it into words. Time for what? Time for change. Time for transformation. Time for the eternal spring to end and something else to begin. Time for her to stop being only what she had been and become something more, something different, something she couldn't yet imagine. Part of her wanted to run, to call for her mother, to refuse this moment, this choice, this change. She thought of Demeter working in the distant field, unaware that the world was tilting, shifting, breaking open. She thought of the meadows, the flowers, the safety of routine, the comfort of the known. But another part of her, a part she hadn't known existed until this moment, felt something else. Curiosity? Yes, but more than that. A sense of rightness, of inevitability, of a story that had always been written and was now, finally, being read. The narcissus in her hand seemed to grow warmer, or perhaps it was her hand growing warmer. The flower scent intensified, filling her entirely, until she wasn't sure where she ended and the fragrance began. Hades remained still, patient, his hand still extended. His horses shifted, their hooves scraping against stone, their breath pluming in the warm spring air. The chariot waited, dark and solid and real. Kore took a step forward, then another, moving not out of compulsion, but out of something deeper, drawn forward by threads she couldn't see, toward a fate she didn't understand, following an instinct that was older than thought. She reached out her own hand, slowly, watching it move as if it belonged to someone else. Her fingers extended toward his. The space between their hands was vast, was nothing, was everything. Their fingers touched, and in that touch, the world completed its turning. The pause ended. Time resumed its flow, but changed now, different, moving in a new direction. The birds began to sing again, but their songs sounded mournful. The wind picked up, but it felt colder. The sun shone, but its light seemed thinner somehow, less certain. Hades' hand closed around hers, gentle but firm. He drew her toward the chariot, and she came, stepping over the broken earth, leaving the meadow behind. She still held the narcissus in her other hand, its petals trembling slightly. He helped her into the chariot, his touch careful, almost courteous. She stood beside him, and the space was smaller than she expected, intimate in a way that made her aware of his presence, his solidity, the way he seemed to carry weight that had nothing to do with physical form. The horses stamped, eager to return to the depths. Hades took up the reins. He looked at her once more, and she thought she saw something in his expression that might have been regret, or sympathy, or understanding. But his face was hard to read, carved from stone and shadow. "Hold on," he said quietly. And then, with a motion so smooth it felt like falling, like flying, like being carried by a current too strong to resist. The chariot descended. The darkness rose up to meet them, to embrace them, to pull them down into the earth. Corey looked back once, just once. She saw the meadow, the flowers, the eternal spring spread out beneath the sun. She saw the world she'd known all her life, growing smaller, more distant, as if she were watching it through the wrong end of a telescope. She opened her mouth to call out, to say goodbye, to speak her mother's name. But the earth had already closed above them, sealing shut like a wound, like a door, like a book whose story had ended so another could begin. And her voice, if she made any sound at all, was swallowed by the darkness. The meadow was empty now. The grass bent where she had knelt. The narcissus lay on the ground where she had dropped it, its petals already beginning to wilt, its glow fading. Above, the sun continued its journey across the sky. The birds sang, though there was no one to hear them. The bees returned to their work, and the spring went on, perfect and eternal, except now there was an absence at its heart, a space where something had been and wasn't anymore. The earth had opened and closed. The maiden had descended, and the world above continued, unaware yet that everything had changed, that the eternal spring was ending, that winter was coming for the first time. The narcissus withered in the grass. Its petals turned brown, and far away, in a distant field, Demeter suddenly stopped her work, her hand going to her heart, a coldness spreading through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Something was wrong. Something was missing. Her daughter, her Corey, gone. Traveling beneath the world. Down they went, down and down and down. The chariot moved smoothly, pulled by the black horses whose hooves made no sound now, as if they traveled through air rather than over ground. Or perhaps there was no ground. Perhaps there was only the darkness, thick and soft as velvet, wrapping around them, supporting them, carrying them deeper into the earth. Corey stood silent beside Hades, her hand gripping the edge of the chariot. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. Her voice had been left behind in the meadow, along with everything else she'd known. She was only breath now, only heartbeat, only the sensation of movement through space. The darkness was absolute at first, not the darkness of a moonless night, which still holds the memory of light. This was primordial darkness, the darkness that existed before the first sun was born, the darkness from which all things came and to which all things return. It pressed against her eyes, soft and insistent, and after a time she stopped trying to see through it. She simply closed her eyes and let herself be carried. Down, down, always down. Time stopped meaning anything. Had they been descending for moments, hours, days? There was no way to measure, no way to know. The darkness held no clues. There was only the sensation of movement, the presence of Hades beside her, silent and solid, and the darkness flowing past them like water, like air, like nothing and everything at once. Gradually, So gradually she couldn't say when it began. The darkness became less absolute. Not brighter exactly, but textured. She began to sense space around them, vast and empty. And then, slowly, details emerged. Stone, the walls of a cavern rising up on either side of them, disappearing into the darkness above. Stone worn smooth by time beyond measure, its surface like glass, like water frozen mid-flow. She could see it only dimly, as if the stone itself held the faintest luminescence, as if it remembered light from some distant age and was still trying to give it back. The horse's hooves began to make sound now, a soft clip-clop that echoed off the stone walls. The echo took the sound and carried it away, repeating it, transforming it, until it became something else entirely. Not hoofbeats, but whispers. Not whispers, but songs. Not songs, but the memory of songs, faint and sad and beautiful. The cavern widened. The ceiling rose higher, or perhaps it disappeared altogether. The walls pulled back until Corey couldn't see them anymore, only sensed their presence in the way sounds echoed, in the way the air felt enclosed despite the vastness. They passed through chamber after chamber, each one larger than the last. Cathedral spaces carved from living rock, shaped by water and time, and forces Corey had no names for. Stalactites hung from above like frozen tears, like icicles made of stone. Stalagmites rose from below to meet them, and in places they had joined over millennia, forming columns that stretched from floor to ceiling, holding up the weight of the world. The air smelled of minerals and dampness, of stone and deep water and age. It was cool but not cold, still but not stagnant, ancient but not dead. The air of a place that had existed long before life walked above and would exist long after life had ended. They passed a river. Corey heard it before she saw it, a rushing sound, water moving fast over stone. And then there it was, cutting through the cavern, black as obsidian in the dim light. The water moved with purpose, flowing from somewhere to somewhere, but both the source and the destination were lost in darkness. This was one of the rivers of the underworld, though Corey didn't know which one. Didn't know their names yet. Styx, Lethe, Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon, each with its own nature, its own purpose, its own ancient power. The chariot didn't cross the river. Instead, it followed alongside it for a time, the water rushing past on their left, constant and eternal. Corey watched it, mesmerized by the movement, by the way it caught what little light there was and carried it along, brief gleams and sparkles in the darkness. After a time, minutes, hours, the river curved away, disappearing into a side passage, and they continued on through the caverns. They passed through a place where water dripped from the ceiling, each drop striking stone with a sound like a bell, like a note played on an instrument made of the earth itself. Drip, drip, drip. The drops fell in no particular rhythm, yet somehow created a pattern, a music that was strange and compelling. Corey listened to it until it faded behind them, the sound growing fainter, fainter, then disappearing entirely. The light, if it could be called light, began to change. Still dim, still barely enough to see by, but different now. Not the faint glow of stone, but something else. A blue luminescence, cold and ghostly, that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They entered a cavern filled with formations that glowed with this blue light. Crystals, perhaps, or some kind of phosphorescent fungus, or something else entirely. Something that existed only in this deep place. The formations clustered on the walls and ceiling like flowers, like stars, giving off their pale glow, turning the cavern into something out of a dream. Corey stared at them, transfixed. They were beautiful in a way utterly unlike the flowers of the meadow. Cold beauty, alien beauty, the beauty of things that had never seen the sun and didn't need to. They had their own light, sufficient unto themselves. The horses moved through this glowing cavern slowly, and their black coats seemed to absorb the blue light, drinking it in, becoming even darker by contrast. Hades' face was touched by the blue glow, making him look carved from ice, from stone, from night itself. He glanced at her once, and she saw his eyes reflecting that strange light. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. What was there to say? Words seemed inadequate here, too small, too fragile to survive in this vast silence. They passed out of the glowing cavern and into darkness again, and the darkness was almost a relief, familiar now, less strange than the cold blue light. Down. Still down, always down. The path, if there was a path, grew steeper. Corey felt the change in her body, the way gravity pulled differently, the way she had to brace herself against the forward tilt of the chariot. They were descending more sharply now, spiraling down through levels of the earth, passing through layers of stone and time. They passed another river, this one wider than the first. The sound of it was different, not rushing but sluggish, thick, as if the water itself was weighted down with sorrow. This river moved slowly, heavily, carrying things Corey couldn't quite see. Shapes in the water, memories, perhaps, or regrets, or the accumulated grief of all who had ever lived. The air above the river shimmered slightly, and Corey heard sounds drifting across the water. Voices? No, not quite voices. More like the echo of voices. The ghost of crying. The memory of laughter. All the sounds people had made in their lives, collected here, trapped in the air above this slow river, replaying endlessly. She shivered, and Hades noticed. Without a word, he adjusted his cloak, extending it slightly so that it covered her shoulders as well as his own. The fabric was soft and heavy, and it carried warmth that seemed impossible in this cold place. She pulled it closer around herself and nodded her thanks, still without speaking. The river fell away behind them. The voices faded, and they continued their descent. Time had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Corey's thoughts drifted, disconnected. She thought of her mother, wondered if Demeter had noticed her absence yet, wondered what she was doing, what she was feeling. The thought brought pain, sharp and sudden, and she pushed it away. She couldn't think about that. Not now. Not yet. Instead, she focused on the journey, on the caverns they passed through. each one different from the last, yet somehow all the same. Stone and darkness and silence, the occasional river crossing beneath them, the sound of water dripping, echoing, filling the emptiness with its patient music. They passed through a cavern so vast the chariot's lights, those dim glows that seemed to emanate from the vehicle itself, couldn't reach the walls. They traveled through absolute space, surrounded by nothing visible, only the sense of enormity pressing in from all sides. Corey felt like they were floating, like they'd left the earth entirely and were traveling through some other realm where physical laws didn't apply. But then walls appeared again, and a ceiling, and they were back in passages and chambers, descending still. The horses never tired, never slowed. They moved with the same steady pace they'd maintained since the beginning, pulling the chariot deeper and deeper into the earth's heart. Their eyes burned red in the darkness, constant beacons, twin lights leading the way. Corey began to lose her sense of self. She was no longer sure where her body ended and the darkness began. She felt stretched thin, spread out, as if she was becoming part of the journey itself, part of the descent, part of the darkness. She noticed her breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the horse's hooves. In and out, clip-clop, in and out, clip-clop, a pattern that was both comforting and hypnotic, pulling her deeper into a trance-like state. They passed more rivers, or perhaps they passed the same river multiple times, winding through the underworld, crossing their path again and again. Each time, the water looked different, black, gray, red like blood or fire, silver like mercury, each river carrying its own burden, serving its own purpose in this realm of ending. The caverns became smaller, more intimate. Passages narrowed until the walls pressed close on either side. The ceiling lowered until Corey felt she could reach up and touch it. The horses had to slow their pace, picking their way carefully through the constricted space. And then they emerged into openness again, and the passage widened, and they continued on. Down, always down. Corey's eyes grew heavy. The monotony of the journey, the darkness, the endless repetition of stone and shadow, it all pressed down on her, inviting sleep. She swayed slightly, catching herself, determined to stay alert. But the temptation was strong, to simply close her eyes, to let go, to surrender to the darkness and the motion and the strange peace that came from no longer fighting. Hades' hand touched her arm, steadying her. "Not far now," he said quietly, his first words since they'd begun the descent. His voice sounded strange after so long a silence, almost foreign, as if language itself was something that didn't quite belong in this deep place. "Not far," he repeated, and she didn't know if he was reassuring her or himself. The light began to change again, not the blue phosphorescence of before, but something warmer, orange like firelight. And with it came a different kind of sound, not water or echoes, but something that might have been voices. Distant, indistinct, but present. They were approaching something. The end of the journey, the destination. The passage opened into one final cavern, and this one was different from all the others. Larger, yes, but more than that, it felt inhabited. Shaped by intention rather than by time, and water. The walls were smooth and deliberately carved. Pillars rose at regular intervals, supporting the ceiling. And there was light, actual light, from torches set in brackets, their flames burning blue and steady, never flickering. And there were others here, figures moving in the shadows. Shades, Corey realized. The dead. The souls who had completed their journey from life and now resided here, in this realm beneath the world. They moved slowly, these shades, drifting more than walking. Translucent, barely visible, like smoke given human form. They paid no attention to the chariot, absorbed in their own wanderings, their own eternal tasks. The horses' hooves rang out against polished stone now, the sound sharp and clear. No more echoes, no more whispers, just the solid clip-clop of arrival. They crossed a final river, this one spanned by a bridge of dark stone, and Corey saw a figure standing at the bridge's far end, tall and hooded, holding a long pole. The ferryman, Sharon, he nodded to Hades as they passed, a gesture of recognition, of respect. And then, rising before them like a mountain, like a monument, like a citadel carved from the bones of the earth itself, a palace. Hades' palace, her destination. The place where the journey ended and something new began. The chariot slowed. The horses came to a stop, their breathing finally showing some evidence of exertion, their sides heaving slightly, vapor rising from their coats. They had carried their burden to the depths, and now their task was complete. Hades stepped down from the chariot, his movements fluid and certain. He turned and offered his hand to Corey, helping her down onto the polished stone floor of his realm. She stood on unsteady legs, feeling solid ground beneath her feet for the first time since the descent began. How long had it been? She still couldn't say. Time had dissolved during the journey, melted away like snow under spring sun. But the journey was over now. She had descended from the world above, traveled through the layers of earth and stone and darkness, crossed the rivers that separate life from death. She had left behind everything she knew, everything she was. And now she stood at the threshold of the underworld, in the realm of shadow, before the palace of the god of the dead. The Maiden of Spring had descended into eternal darkness, and in that darkness, she would have to discover who she was meant to become. The palace rose before her, carved from stone so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was not harsh, not forbidding. There was a dignity to it, a quiet majesty that spoke of age and purpose and careful tending. This was not a place of chaos or cruelty. It was ordered, deliberate, each column precisely placed, each archway perfectly proportioned. A palace built to last not years or centuries, but eternities. Hades led her forward, and Corey followed, her legs still unsteady from the long descent. They passed through massive doors that opened silently at their approach, as if the palace itself welcomed its lord home. Inside, the air was cool and still, not dead air, but restful air. The air of a place that had found its equilibrium long ago and maintained it without effort. The halls were wide and tall, their ceilings lost in shadow. Torches burned in brackets along the walls, those same blue flames that never flickered, never consumed their fuel, simply existed in a state of eternal burning. The light they cast was gentle, sufficient to see by, but not harsh, not bright. Everything here was muted, softened, as if the realm itself understood the need for gentleness after the violence of dying. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing softly against stone floors polished smooth by countless ages. Kore found herself looking around, taking in details. Tapestries hung on some walls, woven in shades of gray and silver and deep blue, depicting scenes she didn't recognize. Rivers and mountains, figures in boats, gates and bridges. The geography of this realm, perhaps, or its history, or both. They passed other beings, servants of the palace, spirits who had duties here. They bowed to Hades as he passed, their movements fluid and respectful. Some glanced at Kore with curiosity, but none stared. This was a place of manners, of protocol, of ancient customs carefully observed. Hades brought her to a chamber that opened off the main hall. Large but not overwhelming. Comfortable. A room with its own hearth where flames burned. Real flames this time. Red and orange and yellow, crackling softly, providing warmth and a strange comfort. "You may rest here," Hades said. His voice was formal but not cold. "Everything you need will be provided." Kore looked around the chamber. There was a bed, large and piled with soft coverings in deep colors, chairs by the fire, a table, shelves along one wall, a window, though what it looked out upon in this underground realm, she couldn't imagine. "I don't understand," she said, finally finding her voice. It sounded strange to her own ears after so long a silence. "Thin, young, why am I here?" Hades was quiet for a moment, standing in the doorway, his form outlined by the blue light from the hall behind him. When he spoke, his words were measured, careful. Because the world above is not the only world. Because spring is not the only season, even though your mother has made it so. Because there must be balance, and balance requires that all things be known, be understood, be honored. He paused. "And because I have been alone here since time began." It was not quite an answer, but Kore sensed it was the only answer she would receive for now. She nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Rest," Hades said again. "We will speak more later." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Kore was alone in this chamber in the palace of the dead, at the center of the earth, impossibly far from everything she had known. She stood still for a long time, simply breathing, taking in the reality of where she was. What had happened? The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm her, and she pushed it away, focusing instead on small things. The warmth of the fire, the texture of the stone beneath her feet, the way the flames cast moving shadows on the walls. Eventually, she moved to the bed and sat on its edge. The coverings were soft, impossibly soft, like sitting on clouds. Her body ached from the journey, from standing so long in the chariot, from the tension of not knowing what was happening or where she was going. She lay back, just for a moment, and the bed embraced her, and despite everything, despite the fear and confusion and the ache in her chest when she thought of her mother, her eyes grew heavy. The journey had exhausted her more than she'd realized. And here, in this quiet chamber with its warm fire, her body demanded rest. She slept. When Corey woke, she had no idea how much time had passed. There was no sun here to mark the hours, no sky to show the movement from day to night. The fire still burned in the hearth, unchanged. The blue torchlight still glowed beyond her door. Everything was exactly as it had been, as if time had stopped the moment she closed her eyes. She rose slowly, finding that her body felt rested, her mind clearer. The initial shock of arrival had faded, replaced by something else. Not acceptance, not yet, but a kind of resignation. She was here. That was simply the fact of things. And she could either fight against it or what? Try to understand it. Try to find her place in it. She opened the door and found a shade waiting outside. One of the palace servants, translucent and patient. The shade bowed and gestured for Corey to follow. They walked through the palace halls, and in the strange, timeless light, Corey began to see details she'd missed before. The palace was beautiful in its own way, austere but not harsh. Everything had purpose. There was no decoration for decoration's sake, but neither was it entirely without beauty. The stone itself had subtle colors, veins of silver and deep blue running through the dark gray. The archways were perfectly proportioned. Even the silence had a quality to it, peaceful rather than oppressive. The shade led her to a great hall, larger than any she'd yet seen. At its far end, raised on a dais, stood two thrones, both carved from the same dark stone as the palace itself, both magnificent in their simplicity. One was clearly occupied. Hades sat there, straight-backed, his hands resting on the armrests, his dark eyes watching as she approached. The other throne was empty, waiting. Corey stopped at the foot of the dais, uncertain. Hades regarded her for a moment, then spoke. "Welcome to the heart of my kingdom," he said. "From here, all the dead are received, all judgments are made, all matters of the underworld are decided." As if in response to his words, Corey became aware of movement in the hall. Shades gathering, not crowding, but assembling in orderly lines. The dead coming for judgment, for assignment to their eternal rest. Hades rose from his throne and descended the dais. "Watch," he said to Corey. "See what I do. Understand what this realm is." And so Corey watched. One by one, the shades approached, each one different, carrying with them the echo of who they had been in life. A farmer, a mother, a warrior, a child, old and young, rich and poor, good and wicked, all equal here, all reduced to the same translucent form, all waiting for the Lord of the Dead to determine their fate. Hades listened to each one. Not their words, most didn't speak, but something else. Their essence, perhaps, the truth of the life they'd lived. He stood patient and implacable, and after a time he would gesture, and the shade would drift away to their assigned place. The fields of asphodel for most, those who had lived ordinary lives, neither greatly virtuous nor greatly wicked. The Elysian fields for the few who had earned paradise, and for the truly wicked, the dark places of punishment. But there was no cruelty in any of it, no anger. Hades dispensed his judgments with a kind of sorrowful certainty, understanding that all lives contain both light and shadow, that all people did the best they could with what they'd been given. He was stern but not unkind, just but not harsh. He was simply fair. Kore watched for what might have been hours or might have been days. Time still held no meaning here. She watched Hades receive the dead with patience and dignity. She watched him shoulder the enormous burden of his role without complaint. And slowly, gradually, she began to understand. This was not a realm of punishment, though punishment existed here. This was not a kingdom of horror, though horror existed here too. This was a place of endings, yes, but also of rest. A place where the struggles of life were finally, mercifully over, where pain ceased, where the tired could lay down their burdens, where justice, often absent in life, was finally inevitably served. It was a necessary place, an essential place, and Hades tended it with the care of a gardener tending precious plants. When the last shade had been judged and had drifted away to their rest, Hades turned back to Kore. He looked weary, she realized, ancient and weary, carrying a weight she was only beginning to comprehend. "Do you understand now?" he asked. She considered the question. "I think I'm beginning to," she said slowly. "You hold the world in balance. Without you, without this place, there would be no justice, no rest. Death would be only chaos and fear." He nodded. Life and death are not enemies. They are partners in the great dance. Your mother tends life with all its beauty and abundance. I tend death with all its peace and completion. Both are necessary. Both are sacred. Kore thought of her mother, of the eternal spring, of the way Demeter had shaped the world to protect her daughter from any hint of darkness or sorrow. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that such protection came at a cost, that a world of only light was not complete, that something essential was missing from the eternal spring. The days, if they were days, passed in a strange rhythm. Kore found herself settling into the routines of the palace, of this quiet kingdom. She would wake in her chamber, dressed in the robes that appeared for her soft and dark, suitable for this realm. She would walk the halls, learning their layout, discovering new chambers and passages. She spent time in the great hall, watching Hades receive the dead. She began to recognize patterns in how he judged, began to understand the nuances of his decisions. Sometimes she found herself nodding in agreement. Sometimes she wanted to question, to argue for mercy, and once or twice she did, stepping forward to speak on a shade's behalf. And Hades listened, considered her words, sometimes adjusted his judgment accordingly. She explored the palace grounds, for even underground, in this realm of shadow, there were grounds. Gardens of a sort where strange plants grew in the dim light. not the bright flowers of the upper world, but their shadow counterparts. White asphodels, dark violets, plants that had adapted to exist without sunlight, that drew their sustenance from the earth alone. There was a garden near the palace where pomegranate trees grew. Real trees, or as real as anything could be in this place. They bore fruit, pomegranates with skin like rubies, heavy and ripe. Kore found herself drawn to this garden, sitting beneath the trees, listening to the absolute silence, the perfect stillness. She watched the shades in their routines. They moved through the underworld with a kind of peaceful purposelessness. Some wandered the fields of asphodel, drifting through the gray flowers. Some sat by the rivers, staring into the water. Some simply stood, existing, released from the demands of life, from the need to do or be anything at all. It was restful, she realized. This realm, peaceful in a way the upper world, for all its beauty, never quite achieved. There everything was always growing, always changing, always demanding attention and care. Here, everything simply was complete, finished, at rest. She began to understand why Hades had chosen her. Not out of cruelty, not even out of desire exactly, but out of a recognition that this realm, perfect in its stillness, needed something more. Needed spring's understanding of growth to balance death's understanding of endings. Needed life's lightness to temper death's gravity. He had been alone here since the beginning, he'd said. Alone with his duty, his burden, his endless receiving of souls. And perhaps he had simply grown weary of the solitude. Perhaps even the Lord of the Dead needed companionship. Kore found that she spoke with him more often. At first, just brief exchanges, but gradually, longer conversations. He would explain aspects of his realm, the geography of the underworld, the functions of the various rivers, the reasons for the rules that govern this place. And she would listen, asking questions, trying to understand. He was not unkind, she discovered. Remote, yes. Reserved, but not cold. He simply existed in a different register than the beings of the upper world. He operated on deep time, thinking in terms of eternities rather than seasons. He saw patterns that took ages to unfold. He understood things she was only beginning to glimpse. And slowly, very slowly, Kore felt something shift within her. The desperate desire to return home began to ease, just slightly, not disappearing. She still ached for her mother, still longed for the meadows and the sunlight, but the ache became bearable, became something she could carry without being overwhelmed by it. She was learning a new rhythm, the rhythm of the underworld, patient, unhurried, still. Where the upper world was all movement and change, this world was all patience and permanence. Where life was about becoming, death was about being. One day or night, or whatever passed for such distinctions here, Kore found herself in the pomegranate garden again. She sat beneath the trees, her back against a trunk, looking up at the fruit hanging heavy on the branches above her. She hadn't eaten since arriving, hadn't felt hunger really. The underworld didn't seem to require sustenance in the same way the upper world did. But looking at the pomegranates, she felt something stir. Not quite hunger, more like curiosity, desire. The fruit looked so beautiful, so perfect, so real in this realm of shadows. She reached up and plucked one from a low branch. It was cool in her hand, smooth and heavy. She split it open, revealing the seeds inside like garnets, like drops of blood, like tiny jewels. She knew the rule, knew it without being told, the way you know things in this place. If she ate food of the underworld, she would be bound to it, would belong to this realm in a way she didn't yet. The choice was before her, clear and simple. She looked at the seeds, so beautiful, so tempting, and she thought about what eating them would mean. Commitment, acceptance, choosing to be here, even partly, rather than simply being trapped here. Was that what she wanted? She didn't know. Not yet. So she sat holding the open pomegranate, looking at the seeds, and let the question rest unanswered. There was no rush. In this timeless place, she could take as long as she needed to decide. The seeds gleamed in her palm. The garden was silent around her. And Kore sat in the stillness, learning to exist in the space between resistance and acceptance, between the world she'd known and the world she was coming to understand. Above, impossibly far above, her mother searched and grieved and raged. The world above was changing, responding to Demeter's sorrow. But here, in the quiet kingdom of Hades, in the garden of pomegranates, Kore sat in stillness and contemplated her choice. The rhythm of the underworld moved through her. Slow, deep, patient, teaching her things she'd never needed to know in the eternal spring. Teaching her about endings and acceptance, about peace that comes not from eternal life, but from understanding that all things eventually must rest. The pomegranate seeds gleamed. The choice waited, and Kore breathed in the cool air of the underworld, finding, to her surprise, that she was learning to breathe in a new way, deeper, slower, with acceptance rather than resistance. She was changing, becoming something other than what she had been. Not Kore anymore, perhaps, but not yet Persephone either. Something in between, something new, something that belonged to both worlds, or perhaps to neither. Something that was still discovering what it meant to be itself. Above, in the world of light and air and growing things, Demeter searched. She had known the moment Kore disappeared, had felt it like a thread being cut, like a part of herself being torn away. One moment her daughter had been present, somewhere in the eastern meadows. Demeter could feel her there, a warm, bright presence like sun on skin. And then absence, sudden and complete, as if Kore had simply ceased to exist. Demeter had dropped what she was doing and ran through the fields, through the meadows, calling her daughter's name. Kore, Kore. Her voice echoed across the landscape, bouncing off mountains, carrying across valleys. But no answer came. Only silence. Terrible, absolute silence. She found the place where it had happened. The grass bent and broken, the narcissus lying on the ground, already wilting, its petals turning brown. A crack in the earth, barely visible now, already sealing itself, but still there if you knew to look for it. Evidence of what had occurred, though Demeter didn't yet understand what she was seeing. Then louder, Corey, and then screaming it, her voice raw with panic and grief. But the meadow offered no answers, only the wind moving through grass, only the flowers nodding on their stems, indifferent to her pain, only the sun continuing its patient arc across the sky, unmoved by her anguish. Demeter began to search in earnest. She walked every path, investigated every grove and valley and hillside. She called to the nymphs, demanding to know if they'd seen anything. But they had been in their own places, tending their own streams and trees, and had noticed nothing unusual. One moment Corey had been there, they'd felt her presence as they always did. And then she simply wasn't. Days passed, or what would have been days, if Demeter had been paying attention to such things. But time had stopped meaning anything to her. There was only the search, only the calling, only the growing hollow in her chest where her daughter should have been. She questioned everyone, the birds who saw much from their height, the deer who moved silently through the forest and might have witnessed something, the streams which carried information from place to place. But none could tell her what had happened, or if they knew, they wouldn't say. The world began to respond to Demeter's grief, slowly at first, so slowly that no one quite noticed when it started. The grass in the meadows grew less green, not brown, not yet, just less vibrant, as if color was slowly leaching out of the world, draining away like water from a broken vessel. The flowers began to close their petals earlier in the day, to open them later in the morning, as if they too were withdrawing, pulling back from the world, seeking some kind of protection from the grief that hung in the air like morning mist. Demeter walked through fields of wheat, and the stalks seemed to bend away from her, not in fear, but in sympathy, as if they could feel her sorrow and couldn't bear the weight of it. The grain that had been golden and heavy began to thin, to lighten, to become less substantial. In the orchards, fruit that had been ripening began to slow its growth. Apples stayed small and hard. Grapes refused to swell with juice. Figs remained tight-closed on their branches. The trees themselves seemed to draw inward, their leaves growing still, their branches no longer reaching quite so eagerly toward the sun. The earth, which had always responded so readily to Demeter's touch, began to resist. Not in defiance, but in confusion. It didn't understand what was being asked of it. Demeter's hands, which had always coaxed growth and abundance, now seemed to carry something else. A heaviness, a sorrow so profound it seeped into the soil itself, making seeds reluctant to sprout, making roots hesitant to spread. The eternal spring began, for the first time, to falter. Demeter barely noticed. She was consumed by her search, by her need to find her daughter. She walked the length and breadth of the world, calling Corey's name until her voice was hoarse, until her throat burned, until the sound was barely more than a whisper. But still she called, still she searched. She questioned the sun god, Helios, who saw everything from his position in the sky. But Helios had been looking elsewhere that day, tending to his own duties, and could tell her nothing. Or so he said at first. But Demeter persisted, and finally, reluctantly, he told her what he'd glimpsed in the corner of his vision. The earth opening, a dark chariot, the Lord of the Dead emerging from the depths. Hades, Helios said quietly. He took her down into his realm. Demeter stood frozen, trying to comprehend. Her daughter, her Kore, in the underworld, in that place of shadow and endings where no living thing belonged. The thought was impossible, unbearable, and yet it explained the sudden absence, the way Kore had simply vanished as if she'd never been. Rage bloomed in Demeter's chest, hot and fierce. Zeus. This must have been Zeus's doing. The king of the gods who made bargains and alliances without consulting those whose lives he affected. He must have given permission, must have allowed Hades to take what he wanted, never mind the cost to a mother's heart. Demeter went to Zeus, demanded her daughter's return. But Zeus was evasive. Yes, he'd given permission. Hades had wanted a queen. Kore would be honored in the underworld, would become a great goddess, would rule beside the Lord of the Dead. Wasn't that a worthy fate? She's my daughter, Demeter said, her voice low and dangerous. Return her to me. But Zeus hesitated. The underworld had its own sovereignty. Hades rarely asked for anything. To deny him now would upset the balance between the realms. And besides, what was done. Kore was already below, already beginning her transformation into something new. Return her, Demeter repeated, or the earth will know my grief. Zeus dismissed her concerns. The earth would continue. Life would go on. She would learn to accept what had happened. Time healed all wounds, even those of the heart. But Zeus didn't understand, couldn't understand. The depth of a mother's love, the completeness of a mother's devastation when her child is taken. He saw only politics, only the balance of power among the gods. He didn't see the hole torn in the fabric of the world, the wound that was bleeding light and warmth and all the green growing things. Demeter left Zeus's presence, and her rage hardened into something colder, more terrible, a determination that was absolute and unyielding. If they would not return her daughter, then the world would share her sorrow. If Kore must dwell in darkness, then the world above would know darkness too. If her daughter must experience endings, then the world would understand what endings meant. Demeter withdrew her gifts from the earth. It happened gradually, like water draining from soil, like warmth seeping out of a stone that had been in sunlight but was now in shade. The crops began to fail in earnest now. Wheat withered in the fields. Barley turned brown and brittle. The vines that should have been heavy with grapes produced nothing but dried, shriveled fruit that fell to the ground uneaten. The trees began to lose their leaves. At first just a few, drifting down on windless days, settling gently on the ground. But then more and more, until the branches were half bare. then mostly bare, then completely stripped. The trees stood skeletal against the sky, reaching up with bare branches like hands pleading for relief that didn't come. The grass turned brown. The flowers closed and didn't open again. Their petals dried and fell away, leaving only bare stems standing in fields that had once been carpeted with color. The meadows where Corey had walked, where she'd gathered flowers and laughed and lived her innocent life, they became fields of dead things, brown and brittle and empty. The birds grew quiet. Their songs, which had filled the air with joy and celebration, faded to occasional chirps, then to silence. They huddled in the bare branches, confused by the change, not understanding why the world was transforming around them. The streams ran colder. Ice began to form at their edges, thin at first, barely noticeable, but then thicker, creeping toward the center until some of the smaller streams froze entirely, their water locked away, silent and still. And then came something the world had never known, something Demeter had deliberately prevented from existing, something she'd shaped the world to avoid. Winter. Not dramatic, not violent, but inexorable. The temperature dropping slowly, day by day, until breath became visible in the air, until frost formed on the ground in the mornings, until the earth itself grew hard and cold and unyielding. The mortals began to suffer. Their crops failed. Their stores of food dwindled. Children grew thin. The elderly grew weak. They prayed to the gods, begging for relief, for understanding, for the return of the abundance they'd always known. But their prayers went unanswered. Demeter heard them, heard their pleas, their desperation. But her own grief was too vast to make room for theirs. Let them suffer. Let them understand what loss meant. Let them experience the cold and the hunger and the slow withering of hope. Perhaps then the gods would understand what they'd done. Perhaps then Zeus would relent and return her daughter. The other gods grew concerned. They came to Demeter, pleading with her to restore the earth, to return her gifts to the world. But she refused them all. Not until Corey was returned. Not until her daughter walked in sunlight again. Not until the wrong was righted. The world settled into suspension, not quite dying. Demeter wouldn't go that far. But not living either, existing in a gray space between cold and dormant and waiting. The trees stood bare, the fields lay empty, the streams ran sluggish beneath their coating of ice, and over everything, a quality of sadness hung like morning fog, thick and pervasive and inescapable. Demeter wandered through this changed world, seeing what her grief had wrought, but unable to stop it. She walked through frozen fields and bare orchards. She passed empty villages where mortals huddled around fires, trying to stay warm, trying to survive on what little food remained. And she felt not pleasure in their suffering, but a kind of grim satisfaction. The world was learning. The world was understanding what had been taken from her. At night, she would sit alone and stare at the stars, those cold, distant lights that watched everything and understood nothing. She would think of Kore, her beautiful, innocent daughter, trapped in the darkness below. Was she frightened? Was she suffering? Did she call for her mother in the endless night of the underworld? The thought was unbearable, but Demeter bore it because she had no choice. She carried her grief like a weight, and the weight pressed down on the whole world, making everything heavy, making everything slow, making everything cold and still and suspended in time. The gods murmured among themselves. Something must be done. The mortals would die if this continued. The world couldn't sustain this grief indefinitely. But what could be done? Demeter was implacable. Zeus was stubborn. Hades was distant in his realm below, unaware or uncaring of the devastation his actions had caused. The world waited. The earth lay dormant, holding its breath, caught between life and death, between the warmth that had been and the warmth that might come again. The trees stood bare. The fields lay empty. The cold deepened, slowly, steadily, as Demeter's grief deepened, as her determination hardened, as her refusal to relent became absolute. And far below, unreachable, untouchable, Kore sat in the garden of pomegranates, unaware of the devastation above, unaware of her mother's suffering, simply existing in the quiet stillness of the underworld, learning its rhythms, discovering its truths, slowly becoming something other than what she had been. Two worlds separated, two griefs, one loud and visible, transforming everything it touched, one quiet and internal, changing only the one who felt it. Mother and daughter, each in their own realm, each dealing with loss in their own way, each slowly being transformed by circumstances beyond their control. The world hung suspended, waiting for something to shift, for some compromise to be reached, for the story to continue moving forward. But for now, there was only the waiting, only the cold, only the sorrow spreading across the land like frost, touching everything, changing everything, making the world understand that some losses are too profound to simply accept and move on from. Demeter walked through winter, the first winter the world had ever known, and her footsteps left no mark on the frozen ground. The wind blew cold across bare fields. The sun shone weakly in the pale sky, and somewhere distantly, the gods continued their murmuring, their debating, their slow movement toward a solution that would satisfy no one and yet be necessary nonetheless. The world waited, the earth slept, and Demeter grieved. In the garden of pomegranates, time continued its strange, suspended flow. Kore, though she was beginning to think of herself differently now, beginning to understand that Kore was a name for someone who no longer quite existed, sat beneath the trees and contemplated the fruit in her hands. She had been holding it for how long? Days? Weeks? There was no way to measure. She had split it open, revealed the seeds inside, and then simply sat, looking at them, feeling their weight in her palm, considering what eating them would mean. The seeds gleamed like jewels, like drops of blood, like tiny promises waiting to be kept. She understood. In that deep, wordless way one understands things in this realm, that this was a threshold, that eating the seeds would bind her to this place, would make her part of it in a way she wasn't yet, would transform her from a captive into something else, a resident, a participant, someone who belonged. But was that what she wanted? She thought about the world above, the meadows, the flowers, her mother's face, the warmth of sunlight, the scent of grass, the feel of wind in her hair. All of that still called to her, still tugged at something in her chest. The longing hadn't disappeared. She still missed it, still ached for it. But something else had grown alongside that longing, an understanding, a recognition, a sense that perhaps there was more to existence than eternal spring, than unchanging beauty, than the safety of her mother's protection. Here, in this realm of shadow and endings, she had learned things she couldn't have learned above, had seen the necessity of death, the justice that only comes after life, the peace that follows struggle, had watched Hades receive the dead with patience and fairness, had walked through gardens where different kinds of beauty grew, had felt herself changing, expanding, becoming something larger than she'd been. She had been afraid at first. Of course she had. Afraid of the darkness, of the unfamiliar, of being taken from everything she knew. But the fear had gradually transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, not yet, but a recognition that fear and growth often come together. That to become more than we are, we must venture into places that frighten us. The pomegranate seeds rested in her palm, patient, waiting, not demanding, simply existing as possibility, as choice, as the future not yet chosen. She thought about nourishment, about what it meant to eat, to take something into yourself, to make it part of your body, your being. In the upper world, she had eaten fruit from her mother's orchards, honey from her mother's bees, bread made from her mother's grain. Everything she consumed had been given by Demeter, had been part of her mother's realm, had bound her to that world of light and growth. To eat food of the underworld would be to accept nourishment from a different source, to acknowledge that this realm too could sustain her. That shadow had its own kind of sustenance to offer, that endings and darkness and the deep places of the earth could feed something in her that sunlight and flowers never had. It was a choice about belonging, about where or whether she wanted to claim a place for herself. She lifted one seed from the split fruit. It was smaller than she'd thought, smaller than her fingernail, but dense and substantial. It held weight beyond its size. She held it up to the dim light of the garden, and it seemed to glow from within, red as heart's blood, red as life itself. One seed, just one. What would that mean? What would it change? She brought it to her lips, paused, took a breath, and placed it on her tongue. The taste was like nothing she'd experienced before. Sweet, yes, but with an edge of tartness, rich and complex. It tasted of earth and stone and deep water. It tasted of night and silence and the slow passage of ages. It tasted of endings that were also beginnings, of darkness that held its own kind of light. She swallowed, and the seed traveled down into the center of her, and she felt something shift, something fundamental, as if a door had opened inside her, or perhaps a door had closed, or perhaps both at once. A threshold crossed, a boundary dissolved, a choice made manifest. She sat very still, feeling the change ripple through her. Not dramatic, not explosive, but real, undeniable. She was different now, had become different. The seed she'd swallowed was part of her, and she was part of it, and through it she was now part of this realm in a way she hadn't been before. One seed. She looked at the others still resting in her palm. 5 more gleaming in the pomegranate's heart. Why stop at one? The question rose unbidden. She had crossed the threshold. The binding had begun. What difference would more seeds make? But she knew the answer even as she asked the question. Each seed was a choice. Each one deepened the connection. Each one meant more time here, more belonging, more transformation. How much did she want to change? How deeply did she want to bind herself to this shadowed realm? She picked up a second seed, ate it, let its taste fill her mouth, its substance become part of her, felt the shift deepen, the connection strengthen. A third seed, the taste familiar now but no less profound, no less meaningful. She was choosing this, not being forced, not being tricked, choosing. With full awareness of what she was doing, of what it would mean, claiming this realm as part of herself, claiming herself as part of this realm. A fourth seed, and with it came a memory, not her own memory, but the seed's memory, or the pomegranates, or the trees. The memory of growing in this garden, of being tended by hands that understood darkness, of ripening in the absence of sunlight, of becoming sweet through different means than the fruit of the upper world. A fifth seed, and she understood suddenly that she was creating balance, that she was choosing to belong to both realms, not fully to one or the other, not entirely spring, not entirely shadow, but both, holding contradictions, existing in the space between. One more seed remained, the sixth. She held it in her palm, looking at it. This one felt different, heavier, more significant, as if 5 seeds meant connection, but 6 meant something else. Commitment, permanence, a pact sealed. She thought of her mother, thought of the grief Demeter must be feeling, the desperate search, the unanswered questions. Guilt washed through her, sharp and painful. She should refuse this last seed, should maintain some distance, some reservation, should keep herself available for complete return to the upper world. But even as she thought it, she knew it was too late for that. She had already changed, had already become someone who couldn't go back to being only Kore, only the maiden of the meadow, only her mother's protected daughter. She had seen too much, learned too much, grown too much. The 6th seed lay in her palm. She picked it up, placed it on her tongue, swallowed, and felt herself complete. Not Kore anymore. Persephone, bringer of destruction, queen of shadow, the one who had eaten of death and lived, the one who belonged to both worlds and to neither, the one who would walk between, carrying spring into darkness and carrying darkness back to spring. She sat in the garden, the empty pomegranate rind in one hand, her other hand resting on her stomach where the 6 seeds now resided. 6 seeds. 6 months, according to the old laws. 6 months she would remain here for each seed consumed. Half the year in shadow, half in light. Forever divided. Forever complete. She heard footsteps approaching. Soft. Measured. She knew without looking that it was Hades. He entered the garden and stood at a respectful distance, waiting. He had known, perhaps, that this moment would come, or perhaps he had hoped for it, or perhaps he had simply been patient, allowing her to find her own way to the choice. "You ate them," he said. Not a question. "I did," she replied. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, deeper, more certain, the voice of someone who had chosen rather than someone to whom things happened. "How many?" 6. He was quiet for a moment. "Then 6 seeds. 6 months. I know. You understand what this means." "I think so." She looked up at him. This Lord of the Dead who had brought her here, who had offered her a throne, who had been patient with her confusion and fear. "It means I belong here. Partly. It means I'm bound to this realm for half of each year. And the other half, I'll return above, to my mother, to the spring." Hades nodded slowly. "The world will change because of this choice." "I know," she said again, "but the world was already changing. My mother has seen to that. Winter exists now because of her grief. This choice, it makes the change meaningful, makes it cyclical rather than endless. Spring and winter, growth and rest, life and death, a balance. You've thought about this. I've had time to think about little else." He moved closer, sat on a bench near her tree. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 beings who had both been changed by circumstances and choices, who both now carried responsibilities they hadn't sought, but had accepted nonetheless. "Why did you take me?" Persephone asked, the question that had haunted her since the beginning. "Why me?" Hades was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his words were careful, measured. "I was alone, had been alone since the world began, alone with duty and endings and the endless procession of the dead. And I looked up and saw you, bright and beautiful and full of life, and I thought..." He paused. "I thought perhaps the realm of death needed to remember what life was, needed life's perspective to balance death's certainty, needed spring to soften winter's edges. You could have asked. Would you have come if I'd asked?" She considered this honestly. "No, probably not. So I took. And in taking, I was wrong. I caused you pain, caused your mother pain, caused the world pain. But I cannot regret it entirely, because look what has come from it. Balance, understanding, a bridge between realms that had been separate since time began." Persephone absorbed this, his admission of wrongdoing, his acknowledgement that the end didn't justify the means, but also his recognition that something valuable had emerged from the pain, something that couldn't have come about any other way. "The gods will argue about this," she said. will try to interpret the rules, find loopholes, negotiate my fate. Let them, Hades replied. You've made your choice. You've eaten the seeds. The cosmos recognizes that choice. The rest is simply politics. She smiled slightly. My mother won't accept it easily. No, but she'll learn too, because you'll return to her. Every year, for half the year, you'll return. The spring will come back. She'll have that to hold on to. And you, Persephone asked, will you be content with half? Half of you here is more than all of no one, Hades said quietly. Yes, I'll be content. They sat together in the garden as something shifted in the cosmos around them. The choice had been made, the seeds eaten, the binding complete. Above, though they couldn't see it, wheels were already turning. Messages were being sent. Zeus was being informed. Demeter would soon know that her daughter had eaten food of the underworld, that the rules had been invoked, that compromise would be necessary. But here, in this moment, in this garden, there was only peace. Two beings who had both been changed, who had both gained something and lost something, who would both carry the weight of this choice forward into whatever came next. Persephone looked up at the pomegranate tree, at the other fruits hanging heavy on the branches. Will I come to love it here? She asked. I don't know, Hades answered honestly, but I hope you'll come to understand it, to see its necessity, to find your own place within it. And if I can, then we'll both carry that sorrow, but we'll carry it together. She nodded, rose, brushed off her dark robes. I should prepare, I suppose, for whatever comes next. There's time, Hades said. There's always time here. But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Above, time was very much moving. The gods were gathering. Decisions were being made. The world was waiting to learn what would happen to the maiden who had descended into shadow and become a queen. Persephone left the garden, the taste of pomegranate still on her tongue, the 6 seeds resting inside her like promises, like anchors, like tiny pieces of darkness she would carry with her wherever she went. She had made her choice, had crossed her threshold, had bound herself to multiple worlds. She was no longer the girl who had reached for a flower in a meadow. She was someone new, someone who contained contradictions, someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere, someone who would forever walk between light and shadow, carrying both within her, bridging the gap between what had been separate since the beginning of time. The choice was made, the seeds were eaten, and whatever came next, she would face it not as Kore the maiden, but as Persephone the queen, the goddess of spring and shadow, the one who had tasted death and chosen life, who had chosen death and found life, who had learned that the deepest wisdom comes from holding contradictions without needing to resolve them. She walked through the palace halls, her footsteps echoing softly, and with each step she felt more certain. This was right. This was necessary. This was the choice she needed to make, not for the gods or her mother or Hades, but for herself. She had found her own agency in the depths of the earth, and she would carry that agency forward into whatever negotiations and reunions lay ahead, certain that she had claimed something essential for herself in the darkness. The pomegranate seeds rested inside her, already becoming part of her. already changing her at a level deeper than conscious thought. And she welcomed them, welcomed the binding, welcomed the transformation. She was Persephone now, fully and completely, and that was enough. The gods had debated, Zeus had deliberated, messages had traveled between realms, carried by swift-footed Hermes, back and forth, up and down, negotiating, explaining, seeking compromise. And finally, a decision had been reached. Persephone would return to the upper world, but because she had eaten 6 seeds of the underworld, 6 months of each year she would spend below, ruling as queen beside Hades. The remaining months she would spend above, bringing spring back to her mother, returning life to the world. It was not what anyone had wanted exactly, but it was what the cosmos required. Balance, reciprocity, the acknowledgement that Persephone now belonged to both realms and could be claimed entirely by neither. Hermes came to fetch her, the messenger god, swift and clever, who moved between worlds more easily than anyone, who carried words and souls and sometimes goddesses from one realm to another. He arrived at Hades' palace with his winged sandals and his caduceus, his smile quick and his manner efficient. "It's time," he said simply. Persephone nodded. She had been preparing for this, though she wasn't entirely sure what preparation meant. She wore robes that seemed to shift between colors, sometimes the dark shades of the underworld, sometimes lighter tones that suggested the world above. She had become something that contained both, and her clothing reflected that. Hades walked with her to the palace entrance. They stood together for a moment, these two who had become partners in ways neither had quite expected. He took her hand, held it gently. "You'll return," he said. "I will," she promised. 6 months. Not a question. The seeds bind me to it. And are you? He paused, searching for words. "Are you content with this arrangement?" She considered. "I don't know yet, but I think I will be. Ask me again after I've lived through the cycle once." He nodded, released her hand. "Then go. Your mother has suffered long enough. The world has suffered long enough. Bring them spring." Hermes gestured for her to follow, and Persephone began to walk, not looking back. She would return. There was no need for backward glances. Instead, she looked forward toward the journey ahead, toward the light she would gradually re-enter, toward the mother who waited. They walked through the palace, through the great hall where Hades received the dead, past the throne that was now partly hers, through the massive doors that opened silently at their approach. And then they were outside, in the vast cavern that surrounded the palace, beginning the long ascent. Up. After so long moving down, or staying still, the sensation of moving upward felt strange, foreign, but also right, natural, the return after the descent, the balance completing itself. Hermes moved easily, his winged sandals barely touching the ground. Persephone followed, her own steps more measured but steady. She was not the frightened girl who had descended. She was someone else now, someone who could navigate darkness and light with equal certainty. The cavern stretched before them, vast and shadowed. But Persephone noticed something she hadn't seen on the descent. A faint luminescence ahead, barely visible but present, a suggestion of light somewhere far above, calling her toward it. They walked in comfortable silence. Hermes, who had carried countless souls and messages, seemed to understand that this journey didn't require conversation, that it was enough to simply move forward, step by step, trusting the path. They passed through chambers she remembered from the descent, though they looked different now, traveling in the opposite direction. The formations that glowed with blue phosphorescence seemed less alien now. The rivers that cut through stone seemed more purposeful, less ominous. Everything was familiar yet transformed by her changed perspective. Up, up. The path spiraling gradually higher, winding through levels of earth and stone, passing through layers that marked different depths, different degrees of separation from the world above. The light ahead grew brighter, still dim, still distant, but perceptibly stronger with each passage they traversed. Persephone found herself drawn toward it, not with desperate need, but with gentle anticipation. She had learned to exist without sunlight, but that didn't mean she didn't welcome its return. They crossed a river, the Styx perhaps, or the Acheron, and on the far side, Persephone paused, turned back, looked at the dark water flowing endlessly toward the depths. She had crossed this river going down, not quite understanding where she was going or what would happen. Now she crossed it returning, knowing exactly what she left behind and what she moved toward. She was not the same person who had crossed it before, would never be that person again. They continued, up through narrowing passages, up through caverns that grew smaller, more constricted. The air began to change, becoming less still, carrying hints of movement, of weather, of a world where wind existed and things grew. And the light continued to strengthen, no longer a distant promise, but a present reality. Gray light at first, like pre-dawn, then brighter, taking on color. The faint blue of sky glimpsed through an opening far above. Persephone's heart began to beat faster, not from fear this time, but from something else. Eagerness, longing, the pull of the world she'd been born to, calling her back. They climbed stairs now, actual stairs carved into the rock, leading upward in a long spiral. Hermes took them two at a time, his energy boundless. Persephone climbed steadily, feeling her legs work, feeling the effort of ascent, welcoming the exertion after so long in the timeless stillness below. The light grew brighter with each turn of the spiral, brighter and warmer. She could feel warmth now, actual warmth touching her skin, so different from the cool, constant temperature of the underworld. The warmth of sun, the warmth of day, the warmth of life. And then, finally, after what might have been hours or days of climbing, they reached the opening. The place where earth met sky, the threshold between realms. Persephone stepped through, and the world of light received her. The sun was overwhelming at first, not harsh, not painful, but so bright after the darkness that she had to close her eyes, had to let them adjust gradually. She stood still, face turned upward, feeling sunlight on her skin like a blessing, like a welcome, like a remembering of something essential she'd almost forgotten. She opened her eyes slowly, blinked, let the world come into focus, and gasped, "Winter." The world above was locked in winter. The trees stood bare, their branches skeletal against the pale sky. The grass was brown and brittle. The fields lay empty, covered in a thin layer of frost that glittered in the weak sunlight. Everything was cold, dormant, waiting. This was what her absence had wrought. This was Demeter's grief made manifest. Winter, the first winter the world had ever known. "Your mother waits there," Hermes said, pointing toward a distant figure standing in what had once been a meadow. Solitary, still, a figure carved from sorrow and determination. Persephone began to walk. Her feet touched frozen ground, grass that crunched beneath her steps. The air was cold enough that her breath formed visible clouds, so different from the eternal spring she left behind, so different from the unchanging temperature of the underworld below. She walked across the winter landscape, and as she walked, something began to happen. Where her feet touched the ground, warmth spread. Not dramatic, not explosive, but real, present. The frost melted, the frozen earth softened, and from that softened earth, the first hints of green began to emerge. Tiny shoots pushing up through the cold soil, grass beginning to remember its color, life stirring after its long sleep, and the earth remembered how to grow. Persephone continued walking, and behind her a trail of green followed, grass turning from brown to living green, small plants uncurling from the soil, the first brave flowers opening their petals, trembling in the cold air but blooming nonetheless. Winter yielding, slowly, to the presence of spring, and the earth remembered how to grow. Demeter saw her coming, saw her daughter, changed, transformed, but still her daughter, walking across the barren field. Saw the green trail following in her wake, and something in Demeter's heart, something that had been frozen as solid as the ground itself, began to thaw. She ran across the field, her own footsteps bringing warmth to the soil, her own presence beginning to coax life from the dormant earth. Mother and daughter running toward each other across a landscape that was remembering, waking, returning to itself. They met in the middle of the field, embraced, held each other with a desperation born of long separation, of grief and fear and love that had never diminished despite everything. "Kore," Demeter whispered, holding her daughter close, afraid she might disappear again. "Not Kore anymore," Persephone said gently. "Persephone now, but still your daughter, still here, still yours." Demeter pulled back, looked at her daughter's face, saw the changes there, the new depth in her eyes, the way she held herself differently, the manner in which she had become someone more than she'd been. "What did he do to you?" Demeter asked, her voice breaking. "He showed me another world," Persephone replied, "and I chose to understand it, chose to belong to it, partially. I ate the seeds, Mother. 6 of them, knowingly, willingly." Demeter stiffened. No, you can't have. "I did, and because I did, I'm bound there for 6 months of every year. But that means I'm here for 6 months too. Here with you, bringing spring back, making the world whole again." Tears ran down Demeter's face. 6 months, only 6 months. but 6 months every year, forever. Half of my time is yours, and your grief, your winter, it doesn't have to be endless anymore. It can be cyclical. It can have meaning. 6 months of my absence, 6 months of my return, winter and spring, death and life, balance. Demeter held her daughter close again, torn between joy at her return and sorrow at the knowledge that she would leave again. But even as she grieved, she felt something else, acceptance beginning to form, understanding that her daughter had grown beyond needing constant protection. That Persephone had become someone who could walk between worlds, who could hold contradictions, who needed both light and shadow to be complete. Around them, the world continued its awakening. The grass grew greener, spreading outward from where they stood. Flowers began to bloom, crocuses pushing through the last patches of frost, snowdrops nodding their white heads, the first daffodils unfurling their yellow trumpets toward the sun. And the earth remembered how to grow. Trees began to wake from their winter sleep. Buds formed on bare branches, swelled, opened, leaves unfurling, small and pale green at first, but growing, spreading, clothing the skeletal trees in new life. The sap began to rise. The wood began to warm. The trees reached upward again, remembering their purpose. And the earth remembered how to grow. In the fields, seeds that had lain dormant began to stir. Wheat pushing green shoots through the soil, barley following, crops that had died returning, the earth offering second chances, new beginnings. The promise of harvest, of abundance, of survival. And the earth remembered how to grow. Birds that had been silent began to sing. Tentatively at first, a few notes, testing whether it was safe to celebrate. But then more confidently, their voices joining, creating a chorus that grew and swelled until the air was filled with song. Welcome, welcome back, welcome home. Streams that had been locked under ice began to flow again. The ice cracking, melting, water running free once more. The sound of it was music, joyful and exuberant after the long silence of winter. Water carrying life, carrying hope, carrying the promise that dry places would be nourished again. And the earth remembered how to grow. Mother and daughter stood together, watching spring return. Not instantly, there was no instant transformation, but steadily, inexorably, the world warming and greening and waking from its forced sleep. Demeter's gifts returning to the earth, her grief transforming into something else, not forgetting, not accepting that nothing had changed, but acknowledging that change had meaning. That loss and return could form a cycle. That absence made presence more precious. Tell me about it, Demeter said quietly. Tell me about the place where you'll spend half your time. And Persephone did. She spoke of the underworld not as a place of horror, but as a realm of quiet purpose. She described Hades not as a monster, but as a solitary ruler carrying an enormous burden with dignity. She explained the peace she'd found there, the understanding she'd gained, the ways in which she'd grown. Demeter listened, tried to understand. It was hard, would always be hard, to accept that her daughter needed something she couldn't provide. That spring alone wasn't enough. That Persephone required both light and shadow to be whole. But she could see it in her daughter's face. The completeness, the certainty. Persephone had found something in the darkness that she'd been missing in the light. And to deny her, that would be to deny her the fullness of herself. You'll come back, Demeter said. Every spring, you'll come back. Every spring, Persephone promised. And the world will celebrate my return. We'll mark it with flowers and warmth and new life. Spring won't be constant anymore. But when it comes, it will be precious because it wasn't there before. People will learn to treasure it, to honor it, because they'll know it doesn't last forever. Around them, the transformation continued. Spring spreading across the land, like water soaking into dry ground. Green replacing brown, warmth replacing cold, life replacing dormancy. The world remembering its other face, its other season, its other way of being. And the earth remembered how to grow. Farmers began to emerge from their homes, seeing the change, hardly believing it. They fell to their knees in their fields, touching the new green shoots, weeping with relief. They would survive. Their children would survive. The impossible winter was ending, and life was returning. Animals that had hidden began to venture out. Deer stepping cautiously into meadows where grass was growing again. Rabbits emerging from burrows to nibble the new growth. Bears waking from their forced hibernation, confused but grateful for the warmth. And everywhere, the earth remembered how to grow. The sun climbed higher in the sky, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Its light strengthened, becoming less pale, more golden. Clouds that had hung gray and heavy began to break apart, revealing blue sky behind them, the color of hope, the color of possibility. Demeter and Persephone walked together through the greening landscape, and with each step they took, life strengthened its hold. They walked through meadows that had been brown and were becoming carpeted with flowers, through orchards where buds were forming on bare branches, through fields where grain was beginning its patient growth toward harvest. They walked and talked, catching up on the time they'd been apart, learning each other again. Demeter spoke of her search, her grief, her rage. Persephone spoke of her descent, her learning, her transformation, both understanding that they had been changed by the separation, that they would never return to what they had been, that something had been lost, but something else had been gained. The day wore on. The warmth increased. By afternoon, the landscape had transformed completely. Spring had returned, fully and undeniably. The world was green again. Flowers bloomed in abundance. Trees were their new leaves. The air smelled of growth and hope and new beginnings. And the earth remembered how to grow. 6 months, Demeter said, looking at her daughter in the golden afternoon light. We have 6 months. 6 months, Persephone agreed. Let's make them count. They continued walking, mother and daughter, goddess of harvest and goddess of spring and shadow, both whole in their own way, both carrying what they needed to carry, both understanding that perfection comes not from avoiding all pain, but from finding meaning in the cycles of loss and return. The earth breathed in the warm air. The flowers turned their faces to the sun. The bees returned to their work, moving from blossom to blossom, gathering nectar, spreading pollen, continuing the great work of life. And the earth remembered how to grow. Spring had returned, would return every year now after winter's rest, would be treasured more deeply because of its absence. would be celebrated more joyfully because it had been lost and found again. The world had learned its new rhythm: winter and spring, absence and presence, death and life, the great cycle beginning its eternal turning, balanced at last between the realms above and below, between light and shadow, between the mother's love and the daughter's wisdom. And the earth remembered, would always remember how to grow. The years turned, as years do. Spring after spring, Persephone emerged from the underworld, bringing warmth and life with her. Winter after winter, she descended again, returning to her throne beside Hades, ruling the realm of shadow with wisdom and compassion. The cycle became as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the turning of the stars. And with each turning, Persephone grew more complete. She learned to hold both aspects of herself without conflict. In spring, when she walked the meadows with her mother, tending the flowers and encouraging growth, she carried with her the knowledge of endings. She knew that these flowers would fade, that this grass would brown and die, that all growing things moved toward their conclusion. And this knowledge didn't make the beauty less. It made it more, made it precious, made each bloom something to treasure because it was temporary, fragile, perfect in its brief existence. And in winter, when she sat on her throne in the underworld, receiving the dead with patience and care, she carried with her the memory of sunlight. She knew that above, the world was sleeping but would wake, that beneath the frozen ground, seeds were waiting, holding the promise of spring within them, that rest was not the opposite of growth, but part of it, that darkness was not the enemy of light, but its complement, its partner, its necessary counterpoint. She had become someone who understood that all things contain their opposites, that life holds death within it as a seed holds a tree, that death holds life within it as winter holds the promise of spring, that to be complete, one must embrace contradiction rather than resolve it. The mortals came to love her in her dual nature. In spring, they celebrated her return with festivals, with offerings of flowers and fruits, with joyous songs of gratitude. They honored her as the bringer of life, the goddess who made the world green again, who ensured that crops would grow and children would be fed and life would continue. But they also honored her winter aspect. They understood that she was not just the maiden of flowers, but the queen of the dead. They prayed to her for good deaths, peaceful passings for their loved ones. They asked her to intercede on behalf of souls, to show mercy to those who had made mistakes in life. They recognized her authority in both realms, her power to give and to receive, to nurture and to release. She was called by many names: Persephone in most places, Kore still, by some who remembered the maiden she had been, Proserpina in lands to the west, Despoina, the mistress, by those who dared not speak her name directly. Each name capturing a different aspect of who she was, who she had become, who she continued to be. In the underworld, the dead came to trust her in ways they had never quite trusted Hades alone. Not because Hades was unkind, he wasn't, but because Persephone had lived, had known joy and sorrow, fear and hope, love and loss. She had experienced what it meant to be taken from everything familiar, had felt the terror of descent into unknown darkness. And so, when she received the newly dead, when she listened to their confusion and fear, they sensed that she understood, that she had been where they were in her own way, that her compassion came not from distant divine benevolence, but from actual knowledge of what it meant to be afraid, to be lost, to need guidance. She became known for her mercy, for her willingness to listen, to consider circumstances, to see beyond the simple facts of a life to the complexity beneath. Where Hades administered justice, Persephone administered understanding. Where he saw what had been done, she saw why it had been done. Together, they formed a complete judgment, fair but not harsh, just but not merciless. And Hades, for his part, found that ruling with a partner transformed the work. The loneliness that had defined his existence for eons eased. The burden he carried became lighter when shared. He learned to see his realm through Persephone's eyes, not just as a place of endings, but as a place of rest, of completion, of peaceful culmination. She reminded him why his work mattered, why death, for all its sorrow, was a gift when properly tended. In the 6 months they spent apart, they each carried the other within them. Persephone brought her understanding of death into the realm of life, teaching mortals not to fear endings, but to see them as part of the natural order. Hades carried her memory of spring into the depths, letting it soften the darkness, letting it remind him that above, life continued, that the work of death served the work of life. When they reunited each autumn, when Persephone descended once more into shadow, it was not with reluctance, but with a kind of homecoming. The underworld had become as much her home as the meadows above. She had claimed it, had made it partly hers through her choices, through her presence, through the wisdom she brought to its governance. And when spring came and she ascended once more, she carried the underworld with her. In her eyes, mortals could see depths they hadn't seen in other gods. In her voice, they heard echoes of silence that was profound rather than empty. She moved through the world differently than she had as Kore, with more gravity, more certainty, more understanding of what it meant to exist in time, to be subject to change, to eventually end. Demeter learned to accept the cycle, though it never became easy. Each autumn when Persephone descended, Demeter felt the loss, felt the cold begin to creep across the land. But she learned to see it differently, not as punishment, but as rest. The earth needed to sleep, to restore itself, to gather strength for the next spring. Winter was not her enemy, but her ally, giving the soil time to regenerate, giving life time to pause and reflect and prepare for renewal. And each spring when Persephone returned, the reunion was sweet precisely because there had been separation. They treasured their 6 months together more deeply because they knew it would end. They didn't take a single day for granted. Every flower Persephone made bloom, every field Demeter made fertile. These became conscious acts of love, of celebration, of making the most of the time they had. The world learned its rhythms. Farmers learned to plant in spring and harvest in autumn, to store food for winter, to rest when the land rested, to understand that productivity was not constant but cyclical, that there was a time for work and a time for dormancy, and both were necessary. both were sacred. The ancient story does not end in ancient times. Like seeds carried on the wind, like water flowing through underground channels to emerge in unexpected places, Persephone's story continues. It moves through time, changing shape while remaining essentially itself, finding new forms, new voices, new ways of being told. In our modern world, the goddess who walks between realms has found countless new realms to walk between. On screens that glow in darkened rooms, on devices held in the palm of a hand, in digital spaces that didn't exist even a generation ago, Persephone's story is being told again and again. Not as dusty mythology from textbooks, not as distant tales from a dead culture, but as living narrative, as contemporary exploration, as something that speaks to people right now, in this moment, in the world as it currently exists. Social media platforms have become unexpected gardens where new versions of the myth bloom. On TikTok, creators craft short visual narratives, sometimes just seconds long, sometimes several minutes, that reimagine Persephone's descent and return. These digital storytellers use filters and effects to shift between light and shadow, between the world above and the world below. They speak in voiceovers, their words layered over images of flowers and darkness, of spring meadows and stone corridors. Some of these creators emphasize Persephone's choice. They focus on the moment with the pomegranate seeds, highlighting agency, the power of deciding for oneself even when circumstances are difficult. They speak about how strength can come from accepting parts of yourself you didn't know existed, how growth sometimes requires descent into uncomfortable places. On Instagram, artists share their visual interpretations. Digital paintings of Persephone crowned with flowers and shadow both. Photographs styled to capture that dual nature, half in sunlight, half in shade. Quote graphics with words about transformation and balance, and holding contradictions. Each one a small meditation on the themes the ancient myth contains. These modern retellings often imagine the relationship between Persephone and Hades differently than older versions did. They explore what partnership might look like between equals, what it might mean to choose connection even when it's complicated, how two people from different worlds might learn to understand each other, to respect each other's nature, to create something together that neither could create alone. It's not that these creators are denying the difficulty of the original story, but they're asking different questions about it. Questions about autonomy, about what it means to transform, about whether being taken from one place can lead to discovering something essential about yourself, even if the taking wasn't what you would have chosen. There are stories that move forward and stories that move in circles. Persephone's story has always been a circle. In the old world, grief was not something to escape quickly. When Demeter mourned, the earth did not hurry her. Fields rested, seeds waited. Nothing was demanded before its time. In modern life, rest often feels like something to earn. But in these ancient rhythms, rest is not a reward. It is a season. Grief, too, is a season. It arrives quietly, sometimes without permission, and stays longer than we expect. Like winter, It can feel endless while we are inside it. But winter, even at its coldest, is not empty. Beneath the surface, roots are alive. Beneath stillness, something is preparing to return. Persephone teaches us that descent is not failure. Going downward does not mean being lost. The underworld is not chaos, it is order without noise. A place where nothing grows loudly, but everything rests deeply. There are times when the soul must go below the surface. Times when brightness feels too sharp and productivity feels too loud. These are not wrong times. They are necessary ones. Renewal does not come from constant motion. It comes from cycles, from allowing what has been taken to be mourned, from allowing what has changed to be acknowledged, from allowing rest to complete its work. Spring does not rush winter away. It waits until the earth is ready. And so do we. When Persephone returns, she does not return as she was. She carries the underworld with her, not as a burden, but as wisdom. She knows now how to hold light without fearing shadow, how to bloom without denying what sleeps beneath. Renewal, then, is not erasing grief. It is integrating it, letting it soften into understanding, letting it deepen compassion, letting it slow us enough to notice what truly matters. If you are tired, you are not behind. If you are grieving, you are not broken. If you are resting, you are not wasting time. You are simply in a season, and seasons always turn. And so these 100 or more facts about Persephone come to a close. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you have enjoyed the expanded descriptions of nature, the underworld, and the understanding that this mythical tale imparts. There are other tales of seasons, renewal, and the duality of life from around the globe. If you have such a tale in mind, please let us know in the comments. I hope that you will enjoy some of my other videos, like the Oracle of Delphi. Until then, relax and perchance dream.